Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. All right, welcome back to this week's podcast here with Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
All right, so last week we had introduced part one of kind of this concept of what do you do when church leaders cover for abusers. And so we titled that Give Parents a Fighting Chance. And this is part two. And so if we left anybody a little bit frustrated last week because we didn't give you clear answers for what to actually do about it, this week is more of a productive we're going to take you through the steps and step by step tell you as non-church leaders, or if you're a church leader who's working with other leaders who are resistant to this, you could certainly be included in that as well. But it's just, what are some common sense and more biblical approaches to how to respond to sex offenders who are in your church? Okay, so where to pick up? I think first of all, I want to talk about what we want to address in upcoming podcasts, because these are issues that we think are really important and they're incredibly common, and we just want to kind of unpack
and they're
these.
All intertwined in some way to this topic that we're discussing today.
Yeah. So we want to talk about one of the things, why church leaders are so hesitant to inform congregations that they have sex offenders in there. So what is it about their theology, their way of thinking? What is it that hinders them from simply informing their churches and saying, hey, we have a registered sex offender
Keep in mind, okay, I wanted you to get that in there, Jimmy, a registered sex offender. For those that might have missed last week, we're not just talking about sex offenders that, say, people have a suspicion of that they may be guilty of. These are registered bona fide sex offenders who have been, their court documents are available to us online. We know that they have been through the court system. They've either
pled guilty or they have been found guilty by a jury.
Right.
With evidence that
we're not talking about
suspected
sex offenders. We're talking about, the real deal here. Okay.
Though they still need addressed.
Well,
we certainly need to address
absolutely.
that.
Yes.
But yeah, we're talking about people who we actually know are on the sex offender registry. They're in your churches. The leaders or some of the leaders know about it, but lay church members don't know. And that's been hidden from the church.
And the leaders have opted. They've opted to not disclose this information to the congregation.
Right.
Okay.
So we want to talk about some of that thinking and logic behind leaders making those decisions so that you have a little bit of a better understanding where they're coming from. Now, keep in mind, I am not defending that decision whatsoever. I think it's reckless. I think it's dangerous. I think it's unbiblical. But I want you to really try to understand and step into their shoes and understand why they come to these decisions to not inform the churches. Because I think if you're equipped with that information, kind of helps you approach them a little bit differently, and really have a much healthier debate, a more informed debate with them, and really understand kind of their thinking behind that. So a couple other episodes that we want to do is talk about inmates behind bars. What does it look like when these guys go to prison? Because the common misconception is that the majority of them are really broken, and they're remorseful, they're in therapy, and they're just, really upset and full of shame over what they've done.
Suffering daily.
Yep, suffering, and their threats of being beat up and all that stuff. We want to actually interview them. We haven't even asked yet, but we have a couple people in mind who actually work in the prison system who we would like to interview so that you can hear it directly from their mouths. Right. These are people who work inside the prison. Mm-hmm. They work with sex offenders, and you can hear it directly from them. I think another topic that we want to cover is inmates in church doors. What do these sex offenders who you guys aren't informed about, what do they look like? From a couple different angles. From the sex offenders themselves, what are they looking for? How are they viewing congregants? How are they viewing children that are within that church? And then kind of flip that. How do church members view them who don't know that they're registered sex offenders because they've not been informed? Is there respect? Is there hesitancy?
Is there suspicion? Do they create red flags? What is that like?
So we want to talk about from the perspective of church members, and then we want to talk about from the perspective of church leaders. How do the church leaders view these former inmates who are in their churches? And you do have a different dynamic between each of those groups.
Right.
And so I think it's interesting and really important to make that distinction and to really help you understand from each of those perspectives. Another topic that keeps coming up is juvenile offenders. These are registered sex offenders whose records are blind because they're juveniles. So these records are sealed. The church leaders almost legitimately never know that these juveniles have a criminal record because those records have been sealed. The reality is that they're dangerous child predators who are in your church, and I think it makes it even more dangerous because now nobody knows that they have a criminal record.
Except possibly, and you and I didn't discuss this prior to, possibly their family members who might be worshiping within that church who have opted not to tell.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. And then we want to do an episode or two on kind of circling back to the church leaders' sympathy towards abusers. Why are they so sympathetic? It's not just about protecting them or not informing the church, but my experience has been in consulting with churches and, reading dialogue back and forth between either leaders and myself or leaders and church members, is that they're highly sympathetic towards the abusers, where their hearts go out to them. And, they flat out ask the question, what do we do to help our brother who's in need? That's the language, their language, not mine. That's the language that they use when they're talking to me about the sex offenders. So I think we need to unpack that and say, okay, what is it that makes them not just protective, but sympathetic towards the sex offenders? And how do we break that? How do we shift that to where they're just simply informed? And I'm not saying that, you chase them out with pitchforks and things like that. I'm not talking about creating dissension in the church.
All you're saying is, we'll zero back into our original topic, leaders, give parents a fighting chance. Let parents know who is in your church.
Sure.
And there's a reason for this. And as Jimmy and I dig deeper and deeper into this, we're kind of going beneath the layers here. I think you'll be given enough information to make good, wise choices yourselves, both leaders and members of your church, as to what it means to keep your children safe.
And the other thing, too, I want to make it clear, too, that when we talk about the church, first of all, I want people to know that we have a deep love for the church. So this is not, it's certainly not an attack on the church. In fact, I'm a full-time minister at a church. I absolutely love and adore the church. So we're not asking people to leave the church. A lot of people give that advice.
No,
They're like, well,
no.
if you find out that there's abuse going on or there's a cover-up going on, leave the church. Well, the problem is, this is not scientific fact. This is opinion. I don't know that there's a church out there that's not covering up abuse at some level.
Some way.
I don't know that there's one out there.
And by leaving, you've not helped the problem at
That's
all.
right. So
you've not done anything to resolve the problem.
So I want to say, simply have very frank discussions with your leaders. And if your leaders object or retaliate, which often happens, unfortunately, I hate to say that, but unfortunately that happens, or ultimately a lot of leaders will try to either kick you out or run you out of the church. My stance is dig your heels in and say, why should I be the one to go? Attempt to stay there to the best of your ability and work these problems out and bring them to light.
Right.
So that's just kind of an opinion. That's just my stance. That's just my opinion.
Well, it's called fighting for what you know is right or what you believe.
Yeah, I think
right.
we're not going to fix the problem if we don't address the problem.
Right.
So what is the answer? What are some things that we can do? Common sense things. And again, this is for either people who are not church leaders in any capacity, or you're a church leader, but you're facing resistance from the rest of your leadership team. You're outnumbered, so to speak. What are some things that you can do? First and foremost, these are opinions. So this isn't like we're writing a manual on this, but my opinion is that parents who find out about a sex offender in their congregation, once you have an awareness of that, find their records. And I'm not talking just the sex offender registry. I'm talking look at court dockets. And some states have really poor digital records, so you might have to drive to the courthouse in the county where the criminal records took place, the criminal activity took place. Secure those court dockets and find out what the actual charges are. Find out how many charges there are. Find out how many of those were waived as part of a plea deal. Know what you're dealing with and who you're dealing with. Become informed yourself.
And that's important because, as Jimmy and I both know, a person can tell you, well, I got basically a slap on the wrist. It wasn't anything all that bad that I did. When they go, say, maybe to talk to the elders of the church or whatever. Mm-hmm. And when you look at that court document, it's totally different because they plea bargained down, which is the way of our law. We can like it or not, but that's the way things often go, where their final charge is just a real diluted charge of what really happened. And as parents, we have that responsibility, if we're safeguarding our children, to know exactly what harm is endangering or could possibly endanger our children. So we need to know the truth.
Yeah, absolutely be informed. These are public records, so you're not prying into somebody's past life. You're not doing anything that's illegal or unethical. In fact, my opinion, I think it's unethical for people to not look at people's records and to know what their convictions were. I think you have a responsibility to do that. So that's step one, become informed. Step two, if this person really is a dangerous person, and that's, that's really hard to define because I think they're all dangerous to some extent. Once you find out about a sex offender's records, I think you as a parent have an obligation, whether the leaders choose to do so or not, to inform other parents of this person's record. So I try to get people to think of it this way. Pretend for a second that I'm not a minister, that I'm not a church leader in any capacity. I'm just a parent of my 3 children. I attend the church where I'm at now. I'm not in a paid position. I have nothing to do with leadership. I find out that there's a sex offender in the congregation, a registered sex offender, a pedophile. I'm just saying that me personally as a parent, I wouldn't be able to go to sleep at night knowing that I had that information and I hadn't given that same information that I received to other parents in the congregation.
Right. Now, you mentioned before your first step would be you go to your leadership. And say,
absolutely.
Hey, did you all know
did you guys
this?
know?
Yeah.
Were you aware?
You know?
Don't just assume that they knew and they're covering it up.
Because
ask them.
They may not.
Did you guys know? If you find out, if you've gone and you've spoken to your leaders and they said, yes, we have an awareness, but we don't inform the congregation of known sex offenders, registered sex offenders in the church for X whatever reason. I don't care what the reason is.
Right.
Whatever.
Right.
My opinion is that as a parent, what I would do is I would send an email blast out to every parent who I knew, and I would attach a link to the sex offender registry that had that sex offender or those sex offenders along with their records. I would send those to the parents with a message that went something like this. As a parent who has very young children in the church, it's my duty to protect my own children. I set the boundaries for my children. I decide what are safe boundaries and what aren't. As a parent, as a protective parent, I want to be informed and I want to know who the registered sex offenders are in the church who have violated other parents' boundaries and molested those parents' children. Also, as a parent, I cannot in good conscience lay my head down on the pillow at night knowing that I took those safeguards to protect my own children but didn't do the same for other people's children.
Absolutely, Jimmy.
As a parent,
absolutely.
I have a burden. I have a responsibility, ethically, morally,
right.
And certainly it's even a legal responsibility, or a legal right anyway,
right.
to inform other people's parents and give them the same fighting chance that I gave my own children. Because if it's good enough for me to be informed for the sake of my own children, right. By golly, it's good enough for me to inform other people's parents. And they can do with that information what they want.
And you're not talking, this is information that you gathered and you put together yourself. This is information.
Yeah, it's public information that's there for a reason.
Right.
These registries are there for a reason.
They are. They are to inform us, beware, beware, beware. Yeah. Now, there are some people who might say, well, didn't that person already serve their time? They've been reformed, and now they're out, and you want to mar their life or make them carry that scar forever, until I would be shown differently that person is reformed. And documentation sure doesn't show us that at all. I would have that beware, beware, beware neon sign flashing. Jimmy and I brought up something to Jimmy while we were talking before the podcast. There's an issue going on at a daycare right now where there is a lady that has given children in this daycare pills to put them to sleep.
Yeah, melatonin.
Okay.
To zonk them out.
To zonk them out. So she has, it was discovered, one of the pills was in a child's lunchbox when he came home from there, and mom discovered it. There's investigation, and anyway, this was going on. This person will be fined and may spend time in jail and whatnot, but when this person gets out, would I, as a parent or now grandparent, I know about this information, would I send my child to that daycare or would I recommend that daycare, or would I be telling everybody, hey, that's the person that gave the pills to those children. That's the person. Of course we're going to say it. Why? We want to keep our kids safe.
Mm-hmm.
We're not gossiping. This is a fact. This person marred their own reputation.
And did it repeatedly.
And did it repeatedly. For a person and to go through the criminal system, Jimmy and I talked about this time and time again, with sex offenses, there has to be a mound of information that is solid. Mm-hmm. It's not based on suspicion. It's solid evidence, or they would not have been labeled a sex offender. And
evidence that's been substantiated.
Right.
I think that's really important. It's not just evidence, and it's not just hearsay. It's not,
proven.
He said, she said. This is actual.
No. Solid.
Corroborative evidence that's substantiated. And I mean, we have a good legal system. It's not perfect by any means, but we do have a good legal system that
when a person is documented as a sex offender, believe me, there is a lot of what they call hard evidence there that's saying yes. And most often than not, the person has also said, yeah, I did this.
Yeah.
I did.
So I think, I think you should inform if the church leaders refuse to. There's nothing legally, to my knowledge, unless we have an attorney who tells me otherwise. Legally, I think you have every right to just pass that public information and say, here's a sex offender registry. I just wanted to raise an awareness. And let them know. Be honest. I'm not saying to do things behind your leader's back. Let your leaders know. Say, hey, just so you know, I'm going to be informing the congregation. Mm-hmm. Right. And let the congregation know that you spoke with the leaders. And I'm not saying to be disrespectful to them, but just say, I had a conversation with the leaders. We had a radical disagreement on whether the church should be informed or not. So I am informing you as a parent to parent.
As a concerned parent, right.
I'm informing you just so that you have an awareness. Right. This information is not to be used to blackmail, to harass, nothing like that. It's just an informative. I would want you to be informed the same way that I'm informed.
This is my belief.
Excuse me.
I think Jimmy is on the same page with me. We've talked about this before. I know if it was me, and I'm just thinking from inside of me, if I was the offender, I would want to let people know, number one.
Yes.
I would say, I need help.
Yeah. Hold me accountable.
Yes. Hold me accountable. I need help. That's number one. Number two, I would insist that I be held accountable at all times. I would not jeopardize, again, the safety of another child. Mm-hmm. Why, you have double layers here of secrecy in the leadership and from the abuser.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So you have a double layer of secrecy there, a pact, so-called, being made, an agreement that, no, we feel it's best that we don't let people know.
Well, and worse yet, this is a point that keeps coming up in discussions I have with people just who are talking about their churches where the leaders are actively hiding abusers. They said that prior to us finding out that this person was an abuser, we had no reason to think anything other than this person is a very trusted person and respected person by the leadership, because this person's up front leading prayers, and this person's up front giving thoughts at communion, and this person's up front leading worship, song leading. We had no reason to suspect, because the leaders approve all that, right? The leaders approve who gets to be up front in worship and who doesn't. And so from their perspective, they're saying, prior to us finding out that they were a registered sex offender, we would have invited them into our home, and we would have had them over for dinner, and we would have hung out with them.
We see the greatest offense that could happen. You make friends when you're in a church.
Absolutely.
You invite people in
your family.
Home. Right. That's your church
family. Right. It's your spiritual family.
And we know that sex offenders are very likable. Mm-hmm. And they are going to mix and mingle with families. So
yeah. Another action step, it sounds a little bit offensive the way it's worded, but I say demand action. Don't allow the church leaders to quietly whisk you away and control the narrative. If they're threatening to kick you out of church, or if they're implying that you should leave church, you're being manipulated and you're being abused. That's spiritual abuse, which is very egregious, very sinful. Just because you disagree with a leader on something doesn't make that an offense that's worthy of being kicked out of the church. And if they start saying that you're divisive and you're causing dissension in the church, you're causing disunity, simply because you disagree with something a decision that the elders or whatever the church leaders are made, I'm sorry, but I don't see that as being divisive in Scripture. When you disagree with somebody,
church leaders are not God,
No.
And we have a moral and ethical responsibility to help each other out.
We should also invite
right.
differing views.
Right.
I certainly don't agree with everybody at my church on any given issue.
Should you.
No,
Right. Nor should you.
But we have an honest dialogue.
Right.
We talk about it. Even my elders. I mean, there are days where we just butt heads like crazy. And
but there's always a mutual respect and a love
there is,
for
but
each
we come
other.
we
But
come to
you're
an
very
agreement.
open. Right. Absolutely.
Even if we disagree,
right.
We still manage to come to an agreement because we have that kind of respect for each other. I will say this, I will say this very publicly, and I think people need to know this. I've never been threatened to be fired. They've never held that over me. And we've had some big disagreements, and they'll say it to the church, and I've said it to the church. We're open about that.
Right.
We let our church know that we have disagreements.
That dialogue should be.
Yeah, but they have never threatened to fire me. They've never said, if you don't do this, you're going to be out the door.
No.
I'm telling you guys this. Please, please, please. This is probably one of the most important things that we're saying in this episode. If a church leader is threatening to kick you out of the church or is wishing you to just go away because you disagree with them, you're being abused.
Right.
That's abuse. Mm-hmm. It's abuse of power. It's spiritual abuse. And don't be afraid to call them on it. So I would say, that point, demand action. Don't allow them to quietly whisk you away and control that narrative. Next point, offer to contact the church's insurance company for the leaders. I like this one because insurance companies, believe it or not, would want to know if there's high-risk behavior that's going on within the body that they insure. Mm-hmm. They will thank you for that phone call. And your church leaders probably won't thank you for offering to make that call. I don't
think you'll get that same thank you from the church leaders.
I have offered on multiple occasions when I interact with people to contact their insurance company for them. I have yet to have anybody take me up on that offer, but that's an important process. If you have sex offenders in your congregation, you should be working with your insurance company. Be transparent with them. Let them know that you have registered sex offenders in your church. Be honest with them too. Let them know that you've not informed your congregation that you have sex offenders. Be open with them and get their feedback. So I would say for parents or lay members, and I would ask your leaders, have you contacted the insurance company? Most haven't even thought of doing that. But if they've not do that, if they've chosen to not do that. We live
in a time right now where that's a must-do.
Yeah.
We live in a time right now where that has to be on the radar.
Yeah.
Of all churches.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing you want to do is create a high-risk environment only to find out later on that you're uninsurable.
And Jimmy
that they're going to reject your claim.
We're talking basics, the real deal here. It's no fluff. This is where we are in life right now. It's an important thing for churches to consider.
Yeah, I work with your insurance company. That's what they're there for. That's why you pay them. And then finally, the last step is to offer help for church leaders to develop policies that make sense and that keep the church informed. Again, this is not, we don't want any of this to be an attack on the church. And I want to say this too, don't do this sarcastically. Don't say, don't have an ulterior motive. Genuinely offer to help your church leaders, because a lot of these guys are just uninformed. I don't think that a lot of them are these evil, wicked people. I just think they have really bad theology, and I think they need to be better informed. Offer to help them out. Point them to resources that are helpful, and volunteer your time. Volunteer to be on a committee that's a safeguarding committee. Make phone calls. If you have people who you can call and get expert advice, volunteer your time for them, and genuinely help. Be genuine about it. In the end, we need to be a community that helps each other out.
I think in the end, any parent who has a concern that takes these steps is most definitely genuine. If a church leader is not willing to listen to this, you have a church leader who is most often abusive, who is using power and authority in ways that they shouldn't. There should be a very open communication about this.
Sure.
And there should be a sensible agreement reached without a person having to do an email blast themselves, or, without a person having to make that phone call to the insurance company. A good, solid, strong, caring, wise leadership is going to say, sit down, we need to talk. We need to figure out what our next step is, how we let the congregation know, how we disclose this information, and take it from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And ultimately that's the best case scenario. And there are churches where that can and does happen.
Yes.
So there are churches out there where, I've witnessed it, where leaders, even if they're making really horrible decisions, that they're very humble. And when things are brought to their attention, I've seen church leaders stand up and ask for the church's forgiveness.
And most often,
I've witnessed it.
You're going to see resistance.
You will. So be prepared for that.
That's right. Be prepared. And here are some, we feel, logical steps that you can take to do what feels morally right in your heart to do. To keep, and ultimately our goal, all of us, our goal is to keep our children safe.
Yes. And hold people accountable.
Yes.
Who we know have crossed multiple boundaries and created sexual offenses, criminal sexual offenses against children. I'll close with this because this is a question that keeps coming up. Last week we had talked about creating laws, and this is just kind of hypothetical. We were just kind of thinking out loud, but creating laws that force churches to inform their congregants if you have a sex offender in your church. And I said probably from a tier 2 on up. Well, right away some people were asking, well, what about tier 1 sex offenders, because they can be just as dangerous, right? The short answer is yes, absolutely. The way our system works is people can plea really serious offenses down to next to nothing. If they plead guilty, if they had no prior offenses, if they, they're a law-abiding citizen in every other aspect of their life, there's a lot of flexibility. So these tiers are pretty fluid. So I was just saying from a legislative point, you're probably, my guess is you wouldn't be able to find any legislator who's going to say, well, yeah, down to your most minor, quote unquote, minor
offense,
misdemeanor offense on the tier 1 level. Yeah, we're not going to write legislation that mandates that churches inform congregants. From a practical standpoint, in the words of my one friend who works in a prison, he works with sex offenders every single day. He works with the parole board. His saying is, a sex offense or a sex offender is a sex offender is a sex offender. He says to treat all sex offenders equally across the board, no matter what they've done, because the reality is none of us has a clue what they actually did. All that we have to go by is the very few criminal records that we have. And he said even that's not even the beginning of a snapshot into what all they actually
what
have
they
done.
were caught doing.
Right.
What they were caught doing.
So he likened it to doctors. He said, every doctor treats every patient as if that patient has AIDS. The reality is very few patients have AIDS or other communicable diseases. However, you wear rubber gloves for every single patient because you don't know. So here we're saying these are people who are registered sex offenders. Our opinion is that this, as far as informing your congregation, you treat every tier, every sex offense the same. Everybody should be informed. You should know what the criminal offense is. And just be aware when you have your child rapist in your church, right?
I was going to say, Jimmy's gone very soft on his words this week.
I have.
Last week, he reiterated time and time again, we're not talking just somebody who got a speeding ticket. We're talking about someone who is a child rapist.
A serial child rapist.
Blank child rape, right. And who has been punished because of it, who has then been released out of prison and now is in your church. You as parents, we believe, have that right to know and that responsibility to know in order to best protect your children.
Absolutely. So our truth bomb for this week is going to be, if you are informed as a parent, or if you are informed as a leader, inform other parents. Inform your whole congregation. That's all we're asking. Just keep them informed. Information is knowledge. Knowledge is powerful, and knowledge helps us protect our children. Keep your children safe out there. Thanks for listening to this episode, and we'll catch you next week. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.